Reid's mornings were a predictable rhythm of lukewarm coffee and the metallic tang of an old toaster. His apartment, a modest rectangle of beige walls and inherited furniture, hummed with the muted drone of the city below. He worked as an archivist, a quiet profession that suited his methodical nature, sifting through forgotten documents, his days a parade of dusty paper and fading ink. There was comfort in the routine, a predictable hum that lulled him into a sense of stable anonymity. He didn't crave adventure, he simply existed, content in the quiet corners of his life. Then came the call. Not from a colleague, nor a friend, but from a solicitor, his voice crisp and formal, a stark contrast to the usual static of Reid's existence. The solicitor spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt named Elara, whom Reid barely remembered, a name whispered once or twice in childhood, like a ghost story. He had died suddenly, the solicitor explained, under circumstances that were, to put it mildly, unusual. And Reid, to his utter bewilderment, was the sole beneficiary of his estate. An estate that consisted primarily of an old cabin, deep within a forgotten forest. A chill, unrelated to the brisk autumn air seeping through his window, traced its way down Reid's spine. He listened, his grip tightening on the receiver, as the solicitor described the property. Isolated. Ancient. Far removed from any semblance of civilization. The words painted a picture of forgotten pathways and encroaching wilderness. Reid felt a strange mix of disbelief and a flicker of something else, something akin to a morbid curiosity. What kind of life had this forgotten relative led, tucked away in such a place? What secrets might an unusual death entail? The following week was a blur of paperwork and practicalities. The solicitor, a sharp-featured individual with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, handed Reid a heavy brass key. "The cabin is remote," the solicitor reiterated, his tone carrying an unspoken warning. "The nearest town is a good hour's drive. Beyond that, the roads become less maintained." He then provided directions, a series of turns onto increasingly narrower lanes, culminating in what sounded like little more than a deer trail. Reid felt a knot tightening in his stomach. He was determined, yes, but a sense of foreboding had begun to settle over him, a damp, clinging weight. He packed his car with essentials, sturdy boots, a flashlight, a portable stove, and a growing sense of unease. The city skyline receded in his rearview mirror, replaced first by rolling hills, then by dense, unbroken forest. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt, the canopy overhead growing thicker, swallowing the light. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He passed through small, forgotten hamlets, their houses shuttered, their fields overgrown. The ocean, a tumultuous gray, crashed against jagged rocks. In the distance, silhouetted against the bruised sky, stood the skeletal frame of an abandoned lighthouse. It stood like a sentinel guarding nothing but the vast emptiness, a testament to the isolation that now seemed to embrace him. The sight sent a shiver through him, a premonition of what lay ahead. This place, he realized, was not just remote, it was forgotten. Finally, the dirt track narrowed to little more than a rutted path, barely wide enough for his vehicle. Trees, ancient and gnarled, pressed in from both sides, their branches interlocking overhead, creating a perpetual twilight. The air grew still, the only sound the crunch of his tires on fallen pine needles. He consulted the solicitor's hastily drawn map, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand. He was close. Too close. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. The cabin. It stood hunched and low, as if trying to shrink into the earth. The windows, few and small, were murky with grime, reflecting the last slivers of daylight like vacant eyes. A porch, rotted in places, sagged precariously, and the front door, a heavy slab of scarred wood, looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, a relic of a time long past, swallowed by the relentless embrace of the forest. A profound silence descended, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves and the frantic beat of his own heart. He killed the engine, and the sudden cessation of sound was deafening. He sat there for a long moment, the key in his hand feeling impossibly heavy, his gaze fixed on the cabin. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. He was here. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Reid pushed open his car door. He stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. The scent of pine and decay was stronger here, mixed with something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood. He clutched the brass key, its cold metal a small comfort against the growing chill in his spirit. He had to go in. He was determined to understand, to uncover the truth behind his great-aunt's unusual death. But as he approached the front door, each step seemed to weigh a ton, and he couldn't shake the unnerving sensation that he wasn't just entering a cabin, but stepping into a history that had been deliberately, and perhaps violently, forgotten. The cabin greeted Reid with a silence so profound it felt like a presence. It stood hunched amongst ancient pines, its weathered timber the color of old bone, the windows like vacant eyes staring into the dense, encroaching forest. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, metallic odor that lingered beneath the mustiness. Reid, ever the methodical archivist, began his inventory, not of historical documents, but of the space itself. He started with the main living area, a cavernous room dominated by a stone hearth choked with cold ash. He worked with a quiet determination, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy window panes, illuminating the forgotten corners. As he cleared away cobwebs and swept accumulated debris, a low groan echoed from somewhere deep within the structure. He paused, broom suspended, listening. The house, he told himself, was old. It shifted, it settled, it breathed its ancient sigh. He resumed his task. Later, as twilight bled through the trees, painting the room in shades of bruised purple and gray, Reid found himself in the kitchen, wiping down a scarred wooden counter. A clatter from the pantry made him jump. A tin, perhaps, had fallen from a high shelf. He opened the pantry door cautiously, peering into the gloom. Nothing lay on the floor. All the tins and jars stood neatly, albeit dustily, on their shelves. He frowned, a prickle of unease stirring the calm surface of his mind. He closed the pantry door, dismissing the incident, but the quiet of the cabin now felt less peaceful, more watchful. The first night was a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The wind hummed a low, mournful tune through gaps in the walls. The timbers creaked like old bones protesting their burden. But then, a distinct scratching began, a rhythmic rasp against wood, seemingly from the attic directly above his temporary sleeping quarters. It wasn't the frantic scurry of a rodent, it was too deliberate, too slow. He lay rigid, listening, his breath held. The sound would stop for a long moment, then resume, always from the same spot. He told himself it was just a branch brushing against the roof, or perhaps a squirrel trapped in the eaves. Yet, the thought of a squirrel meticulously scratching in such a measured rhythm felt absurd. The next morning, the scratching was gone. Reid climbed into the attic, flashlight in hand, determined to find its source. He found no evidence of rodents, no telltale nests, no disturbed insulation. He checked the roofline, the vents. Nothing. He rationalized it as the wind playing tricks with loose shingles, a sound that amplified and distorted in the confined space. Still, a faint disquiet lingered, a sensation of something unseen, retreating just beyond his reach. Days blurred into a routine of exploration and subtle unsettling occurrences. A book he'd left on a table would be found on the floor, open to a different page. A window he was certain he'd latched would be slightly ajar, letting in a whisper of cold air. Each time, he'd find a logical explanation, the settling of the house, a draft, his eyes playing tricks in the dim light. He was tired, he reasoned, the solitude and the physical labor of cleaning an old cabin were taking their toll. One afternoon, while sifting through a dusty chest in a rarely used study, he found it. Tucked beneath moth-eaten linens and yellowed photographs, lay a small, leather-bound journal. The leather felt strangely cool, despite the warmth of the room. He ran a thumb over the symbols, a faint tremor passing through him. This was not just an old book, it felt ancient, imbued with a strange, heavy stillness. He opened it carefully. The pages, brittle and thin, were filled with a spidery, looping script, faded with age. The language wasn't immediately recognizable, but it felt old, archaic. He could make out occasional words, fragmented phrases that hinted at a forgotten tongue. As he turned a page, a brittle, sepia-toned photograph slipped out. It depicted a stark, imposing structure on a desolate stretch of coastline, an abandoned lighthouse. Its tower rose like a skeletal finger against a stormy sky, and at its base, almost swallowed by the gloom, stood a solitary figure, unidentifiable in the faded image. He looked from the photograph to the strange symbols on the journal's cover, then back to the script, a knot tightening in his stomach. The rationalizations, the careful dismissals, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't just an old house settling. This was something else entirely. Reid's initial days in the cabin were a slow, insidious unraveling. The profound silence that had first greeted him now felt less like an absence and more like a heavy, breathing presence. He tried to dismiss the small things, the way the floorboards creaked in rooms he wasn't in, the distant, almost imperceptible scratching sounds from within the walls, the phantom drafts that raised goosebumps on his arms even when the air was still. He blamed the age of the structure, the settling timber, the wind playing tricks through gaps in the ancient frame. His mind, ever the pragmatist, searched for logical anchors in the rising tide of unease. Then the distortions began. A reflection in a grimy windowpane would hold his gaze a fraction too long, his own face seeming to sag, eyes hollowed, before snapping back to normal. The glass of water on his bedside table would shimmer, its surface rippling as if disturbed by an unseen pebble, yet the cabin remained unmoving, silent. He found himself pausing, staring at ordinary objects, a chipped ceramic mug, a faded tapestry, convinced they had shifted, if only by an inch, from where he'd left them. His rational mind, a fortress built on logic and scientific explanation, began to show hairline cracks. One evening, as dusk bled indigo through the forest canopy, Reid was attempting to read by the dim glow of an oil lamp. A faint, almost musical hum started, barely audible, vibrating through the very floor beneath his feet. It grew, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once, pressing against his eardrums. He clamped his hands over his ears, but the sound persisted, not external, but internal, resonating deep within his skull. It wasn't a physical noise, it was a sensation of sound, a pressure. He felt a profound sense of disorientation, the words on the page blurring, his vision swimming. The air grew heavy, thick with an odor of damp soil and something metallic, like old blood. He stumbled to his feet, knocking the lamp, sending its light dancing erratically across the walls. Reid stood panting, his shirt clinging to his skin, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could no longer deny it. This was not the house settling. This was not his imagination. He began his research in the cabin itself, meticulously sifting through the few remaining belongings of his distant relative. The papers were mostly mundane, old bills, faded receipts, a few yellowed letters from decades past. Its pages were filled with cramped, spidery handwriting, much of it illegible, but fragments stood out like jagged shards. He packed a bag, the journal carefully wrapped, and drove to the nearest small town, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clinging to the coastline. The general store owner, a weathered old man with eyes like polished stones, directed him to an old woman known for her knowledge of local history. She lived in a ramshackle cottage near the shore, her porch cluttered with sea glass and driftwood. The old woman, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, listened to Reid's vague inquiries about the cabin's history, his gaze unervingly steady. More than just ships and weather. He was an observer. The abandoned lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, a lonely sentinel against the churning gray sea. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of salt, decay, and damp paper. The spiral staircase groaned under his weight as he ascended, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the broken windows. Tucked into a hidden alcove, beneath a loose floorboard that mirrored the one in his cabin, Reid found another set of journals, larger and more robust, bound in canvas. These journals were meticulously kept, dated entries spanning nearly a century, from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. They documented not only maritime observations but also the strange occurrences in the surrounding forest and, specifically, near the site of his cabin. The lightkeeper, it seemed, had been a diligent chronicler of the inexplicable. The pact must be honored. The blood will run. Reid stumbled out of the lighthouse, the salty wind whipping his hair, the cries of gulls sounding like mockery. The lightkeeper's journals, combined with the fragments from his relative's notes and the old woman's cryptic warnings, painted a terrifying picture. The cabin wasn't just built on an ancient burial ground, it was situated on a place that demanded something, a place that had been fed for generations. His distant relative hadn't been an eccentric recluse, he had been the latest in a long line of caretakers, perhaps even guardians, of a horrifying arrangement. The pact wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, binding agreement, and Reid, by inheriting the cabin, had inadvertently inherited its terrible obligations. He was not just an observer, he was now inextricably part of the horror. And the cycle, whatever it entailed, was due to begin anew. Reid stumbled out of the abandoned lighthouse, the salty wind whipping his hair into a frenzy, the cries of gulls sounding less like birds and more like the mocking laughter of something unseen. The lightkeeper's fragmented journals, combined with the scraps from his relative's notes and the old woman's cryptic warnings, had painted a terrifying, incomplete picture. He'd glimpsed the edges of a pact, a lineage, a recurring tragedy, but the full horror remained shrouded. A cold certainty settled in his bones, heavier than the sea spray clinging to his jacket. There had to be more. The lightkeeper, who had obsessively documented the anomalies, the creeping dread emanating from the forest, wouldn't have stopped at scattered observations. There was a meticulousness to the few pages Reid had found, a hidden order suggesting a deeper, more complete record. He turned back, his gaze sweeping over the derelict structure, the peeling paint, the broken panes of glass. The wind howled through the gaps, a mournful song. He re-entered the abandoned lighthouse, the air inside thick with the scent of brine, dust, and decay. Each creak of the aging floorboards under his boots echoed in the sudden quiet. His eyes scanned the familiar, desolate rooms, searching for anything out of place. The lightkeeper, if he truly understood the gravity of what he observed, would have hidden the truth well. In the small, cramped office at the base of the tower, where the lightkeeper had meticulously maintained his logs, Reid noticed a faint discoloration on a section of the wall behind a long-abandoned, heavy wooden desk. He knelt, tracing the line with a finger, feeling the slight give. He pushed harder, testing the resistance. Inside, nestled amongst layers of brittle, yellowed cloth, was a single, leather-bound volume. It was thicker than any of the other journals he'd seen, its cover worn smooth, the leather cracked like ancient skin. He pulled it out, his fingers trembling, the weight of it surprisingly substantial in his hands. This was it. This felt like the missing piece. He carried it to the window, letting the weak, gray light illuminate the first page. The script was the same neat, precise hand as the other fragments, but this was different. This was a narrative, a confession, a desperate warning. The lightkeeper had penned his final, damning observations, detailing not just the phenomena but their origins. Reid began to read, his breath catching in his throat with each line. The entries spoke of the original settlers, his own ancestors, who had arrived in this remote wilderness centuries ago. They had found the land fertile, the forest teeming, but beneath the surface, something ancient stirred. Not with a deity, but with the land itself, or rather, with the entity that had long claimed it. The entity, the lightkeeper had written, fed on something intangible, something primal, fear, despair, life. The pact stipulated a regular offering, a sacrifice from the lineage of the settlers, a bloodline tethered to the land. Not a single, grand gesture, but a continuous, generational tithe. Each generation, a member of the family would be claimed, drawn back into the earth, their essence fueling the dormant horror. The cabin, Reid read with a sickening lurch, wasn't just built on the burial ground, it was built as a conduit, a focus point for the entity, a place where the barrier was thinnest, where the claims could be made. His distant relative's sudden, mysterious death wasn't mysterious at all. It was the latest payment. The lightkeeper, a descendant of a family tasked with observing the pact's grim enforcement, had meticulously documented the growing impatience of the entity, the tightening grip on the lineage, the escalating manifestations when the payment was delayed or resisted. The entity wasn't just tied to the land, it was the land, or an inseparable, malevolent aspect of it, demanding its due, twisting reality to claim what it saw as its own. Reid's hands shook so violently he almost dropped the heavy volume. He was not merely an inheritor of a cabin, he was an inheritor of a curse, a designated offering. They were the entity reaching out, asserting its claim, preparing to collect. He was next. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He was trapped, bound by a centuries-old bargain made by his ancestors, and the horror had finally come for him. The lightkeeper's fragmented journals, combined with the scraps from his relatives' notes and the elders' whispered warnings, had coalesced into a truth far colder than the coastal air. The pact. It wasn't merely a historical curiosity, a property dispute, or a simple family curse. It was a binding, a claim of blood, specific to his lineage. The entity wasn't just tied to the cabin, it was tied to him, and those who shared his name, demanding their presence, consuming their despair. His relative's death, the elder had implied, was merely the final act of one claim, opening the door for the next. And the lightkeeper, according to his frantic scribblings, had spent his final days not documenting the sea, but desperately searching for an escape route, a loophole in the ancient binding. The forest, which had once seemed merely dense, now loomed, a wall of skeletal branches reaching, grasping. He pulled up the gravel path, the tires crunching like bones underfoot. The cabin, stark against the twilight, no longer held any pretense of rustic charm. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was absolute, pressing in, heavy and suffocating. The air itself seemed to vibrate with an unseen presence, a low hum that resonated not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. Reid moved through the familiar rooms, but nothing felt familiar. A chair in the living room was subtly askew, not as he'd left it. A book on the table lay open to a different page, one filled with dense, archaic script he didn't recognize. He brushed a hand over the wooden surface, and a shiver ran through him. The cabin was watching him. It was waiting. He needed to confirm what he'd learned, to find some external validation, some way to puncture the isolation that was already beginning to consume him. His phone. He pulled it from his pocket, the smooth glass feeling unnervingly fragile. He scrolled to the number of the local constable, a gruff but seemingly sensible man he'd spoken with briefly about his relative's odd demise. His thumb hovered over the call button. He pressed it. The phone rang once, twice. Then, instead of a third ring, a burst of static shrieked through the earpiece, sharp and piercing. Reid flinched, pulling the phone away, but the sound persisted, twisting, morphing. It wasn't just static. Reid stared at the blank screen, his breath catching in his throat. He tried again. His hands began to tremble. He tried a third time, dialing a friend, a colleague back in the city. Anything. This time, the call connected, or seemed to. Is that you? What's wrong? You sound. The voice wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from behind him. The phone, still pressed to his ear, was emitting only a low, rhythmic hum, like a distant heartbeat. He looked at the screen. The call was still active, supposedly. But the voice had been in the room. He tore the phone from his ear, throwing it onto the plush rug as if it were a venomous thing. The cabin wasn't just listening, it was mimicking. It was twisting reality, using his own connections, his own fears, against him. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by his own terrified visage. He stumbled backwards, knocking into a sturdy, antique dresser. He knew then that the elder's warnings were true. The cabin wasn't a place he could simply abandon. It was a living trap, closing its jaws, sealing him inside. And the entity within, it wasn't just claiming the structure, it was claiming him, body and mind, twisting his world until escape became an unthinkable, impossible dream. The pact had come due. The line went dead with a soft click. He tried again. The same static, the same horrifying whisper. Then a different voice, one that sounded eerily like his relative. Imbued with a profound, desolate sorrow, it has claimed you. A cold tremor snaked down Reid's spine, not from the chill of the cabin. From the absolute finality in that voice. Claimed. The word echoed, a death knell. He wasn't just dealing with a haunting, he was dealing with something that consumed, that took. His hands, numb moments before, now moved with frantic urgency. There was no more time for hesitation, no more parsing cryptic messages. He snatched his backpack, already packed with essentials from his earlier, half-hearted attempts to prepare for departure. The cabin, in its usual fashion, seemed to resist. A floorboard groaned behind him as he crossed the living room, a low, drawn-out sound like a sigh. The latch on the front door, usually stiff, now felt oddly loose, rattling in its frame as if eager to be opened, or perhaps, to mock his departure. He backed out of the overgrown drive, the tires crunching on gravel that felt unusually soft, almost spongy. He just pressed the accelerator, determined to put as much distance between himself and that place as possible. The narrow dirt track that served as the only access to the cabin usually led to a paved county road after a few miles. Reid drove, his eyes scanning the dense tree line, searching for any familiar marker. The trees, however, seemed to have shifted. The forest floor, normally carpeted in fallen leaves, was now a uniform blanket of pale, velvety moss, muffling the sound of his tires. He should have reached the paved road by now. Panic began to prickle at the edges of his calm. He slowed the vehicle, peering through the windshield. The road ahead looked identical to the road behind, a tunnel of green and brown, stretching into an indefinite distance. He passed a particularly distinctive, lightning-scarred pine for what felt like the third time. He pounded the steering wheel, a frustrated shout tearing from his throat. The engine sputtered in response, a dry, rattling cough, then died. He tried the ignition again. Nothing. Trapped. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. He scanned the impenetrable woods, a profound sense of helplessness washing over him. A faint, weathered structure, standing sentinel against the bruised sky, its beacon long dead. An abandoned lighthouse. He didn't remember it being anywhere near his route to the cabin. This forest was playing tricks with him, twisting his reality, leading him to this place. The ground became uneven, littered with sea-smoothed stones and brittle shells, even though the cabin was miles inland. The lighthouse loomed, a cylinder of crumbling brick and salt-eaten iron, its glassless lantern room like a gaping eye socket. A strange, metallic tang filled the air, like old blood and rust. He pushed open the heavy, barnacled door. It groaned on rusted hinges, revealing a spiral staircase ascending into gloom. He climbed, his breath growing ragged, a desperate hope for a signal, a way out, driving him higher. The lantern room was a circular cage of broken glass and twisted metal. No road, no sign of civilization, just the endless, conspiring forest. Then, his eyes caught on something etched into the leaden window frame, partially obscured by flaking paint. A symbol. Not one he recognized from any local folklore or maritime history. It was a crude, angular design, two interlocking triangles, one pointing up, one down, with a single, elongated eye at their center. He had seen this symbol before. Not in person, but in a faded photograph tucked away in a hidden compartment of his relative's old desk back at the cabin, a picture of his great-grandparents standing stiffly beside a similar, albeit smaller, etching on a stone tablet. The line holds. It was a phrase his relative had muttered once, a long time ago, a half-remembered fragment from a hushed family conversation. It was a secret, a pact, a promise. This symbol, this phrase, linking the cabin, his family, and now this remote, abandoned lighthouse, meant the entity wasn't confined to the cabin itself. Its influence stretched, its reach was long. It was everywhere. A soft, scraping sound came from directly behind him. Just the empty, windswept room. But the air suddenly grew heavy, pressing in on him. He backed away, stumbling on a loose piece of metal, his mind reeling. The forest hadn't merely disoriented him, it had guided him here. The entity had led him to this place, to this revelation. He wasn't escaping, he was being shown. Shown the breadth of its power, the futility of his efforts. There was no escape. Not from the cabin, not from the forest, not from the insidious reach of whatever had claimed his relative, and was now, slowly, inexorably, claiming him. The incomplete word, the Leah pulsed in Reid's mind, a phantom heartbeat against his temples. He stared at the faded photograph, the image of his great-grandparents standing stiffly, their faces grim, beside the etched stone. The symbol on the stone was identical to the one he'd found hidden in the cabin, only larger, more weathered, like a scar on the very earth. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was not a coincidence. This was a trail. She'd mentioned the sea, the edge of the world, a beacon that had long ceased to shine. The abandoned lighthouse. The sky, bruised purple and gray, mirrored the turmoil in his gut. Finally, a skeletal silhouette against the churning ocean, the abandoned lighthouse. It stood like a forgotten sentinel, its brickwork crumbling, windows long shattered, leaving vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving waves. Rust stained its once gleaming white facade, weeping like old wounds. The wind howled through its empty chambers, a mournful, unending dirge. He stepped out, the sand crunching under his boots, the spray stinging his face. The air here felt different, charged with a raw, primal energy, ancient and vast. He pushed open the heavy, salt-corroded door at the base of the lighthouse, groaning on rusted hinges. Inside, the circular stairwell spiraled upwards into gloom, the steps slick with sea damp and coated in a fine layer of dust and guano. He ascended, his hand scraping against the rough, cold stone, the climb an ordeal of both physical exertion and mounting dread. Each step brought him closer to what? The truth, he hoped. The truth, he feared. Near the top, where the light chamber should have been, the staircase ended abruptly at a heavy, iron-bound door, unlike any other he'd seen in the structure. This was no ordinary storage room. He pushed against it, and to his surprise, it yielded with a low, grinding groan, revealing not a lantern room, but a small, circular chamber, entirely enclosed. As his eyes adjusted, he saw it. Reid's breath hitched. He traced the rough lines with a trembling finger. The carvings depicted a lineage, a family tree, stretching back into antiquity, each branch culminating in a figure marked with the symbol. And beneath them, a narrative unfolded. It was a pact, carved in stone, not written in ink. Generations ago, his ancestors, facing a blight, a famine, or perhaps a more subtle, creeping despair, had sought to secure their prosperity. They had made a bargain with something that resided deep within the land, a primal, territorial force, an ancient guardian. It was not a spirit in the conventional sense, but an elemental consciousness, tied to the very earth of the forest, the burial ground. The entity demanded a tithe, a periodic offering from the bloodline itself. Not just blood, but life. A sacrifice of one, at a specific juncture, to renew the pact, to feed the guardian, to maintain the delicate balance. Reid's great-grandparents in the photograph. They weren't just posing. They were standing beside the evidence of a sacrifice, perhaps even having just performed one. It was the brand of their servitude, the seal of the pact. The carving showed the guardian growing stronger, the land flourishing, but at a terrible cost. Each sacrifice, each life, twisted the entity further, making its demands more specific, more insidious. It craved not just life, but awareness, consciousness, memory. It fed on the essence of what made a person them. And then, the final carving, eerily similar to himself, stood alone, the lineage mark glowing ominously on their chest. Below it, a single, stark image, a broken circle, and then, a choice. Sacrifice, or severance. The carving implied that if the pact was broken, if the tithe was refused, the guardian would turn on the bloodline, consuming them all, not just one. It would reclaim what it was owed, and then some, leaving nothing but barren earth and forgotten memories. Reid stumbled back, his mind reeling. The sudden, mysterious deaths in his family, the strange phenomena at the cabin, the twisting reality, it was all connected. The entity was not just claiming the cabin, it was claiming him. He was the next offering. He was the next one due. He understood now. The symbol on the stone was identical to the one he'd found hidden in the cabin's foundation. The truth, cold and sharp, had finally clicked into place. The lineage. The pact wasn't just a secret, it was a bloodline's burden, and he, Reid, was the current, unwitting bearer. The cabin wasn't merely a nexus, it was a trap. The true locus of the binding, he suddenly understood, lay elsewhere. He drove, the old truck rattling over forgotten logging roads, the map. Clutched in his hand a brittle relic of his great-grandfather's possessions. It showed a single, stark X marking a coastal point, far from the forest's suffocating embrace. An abandoned lighthouse. The irony was a bitter taste, a beacon meant for guidance, now a monument to a forgotten betrayal. The air grew heavy with salt and decay as he neared the coast. The wind, once a gentle sigh through the pines, became a relentless, tearing gale. He parked the truck near a crumbling bluff, the tires sinking into damp sand. Before him, stark against a bruised, twilight sky, stood the abandoned lighthouse. Its paint was flaking like diseased skin, windows long shattered, leaving gaping, empty eyes. A single, skeletal iron staircase spiraled around its exterior, leading to the broken lantern room. The very structure seemed to hum with a desolate energy, a waiting silence that pressed in on him. Reid pushed through the rusted iron door, the groan of metal echoing like a cry of protest. Each step Reid took on the concrete floor sent a shiver up his spine. The silence was not empty, it was pregnant, watchful. The wind shrieked through the broken panes above, a mournful, inhuman keening. On the first landing, he found it. Etched into the wall, partially obscured by generations of salt spray and grime, was the familiar symbol from the photograph in the cabin. Beneath it, a series of smaller, more intricate carvings. They weren't just symbols, they were instructions. A ritual. A way to sever the tie. But it required a sacrifice. Not of life, he realized with a sickening lurch in his gut, but of lineage. He had to erase them. The pact demanded a continuous offering, a tether to the living world. To break it meant to cut the thread of his ancestry, to allow the entity to consume the very memory of his great-grandparents, his grandparents, even his own parents, wiping their existence from time as if they had never been. It was a horrifying choice, a complete annihilation. A low, guttural murmur began to emanate from the very stone, a sound that seemed to originate from within his own skull. The entity was here. It wasn't a physical form, but a crushing pressure, a psychic weight that threatened to buckle his knees. They are nothing. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on the symbols. He'd brought the small, iron-bound journal he'd found in the cabin, its pages filled with his great-grandmother's frantic scrawl. The photograph. He ascended to the lantern room, the wind a furious, unseen hand trying to shove his back down the stairs. Glass shards crunched under his boots. The open space was a vortex of sound and frigid air. The entity's presence was overwhelming now, a palpable malevolence that made his teeth ache. It pressed against his mind, conjuring images, his great-grandparents, their faces twisted in silent agony, his parents' faces flickering, fading, as if erased from a faulty projection. Reid tore a strip of cloth from his shirt. With a shard of broken glass from the lantern room, he pricked his finger, the pain a sharp anchor in the swirling chaos. He pressed the drop of blood onto the grim face of his great-grandfather in the photograph. Then, with trembling hands, he sprinkled the dust from the cabin's foundation around the perimeter of the lantern room, tracing the symbol he'd memorized from the wall below. He pulled a few strands of hair from his head, the strands feeling strangely heavy, almost alive, as he laid them over the symbol. The lighthouse screamed. Not the wind, but a sound that tore at the fabric of reality, a sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated directly in his bones. The very air around him seemed to solidify, pressing in, threatening to crush him. The fading images of his family intensified, their faces contorting in a final, silent plea. Don't erase us. The entity wanted him to falter, to break, to choose his lineage over salvation. Reid closed his eyes, gritting his teeth. He remembered the horror, the suffering, the malevolence that had plagued his life since inheriting the cabin. This was the only way. With a desperate, guttural cry, he slammed the journal shut over the bloodied photograph, pressing down with all his might, forcing the last elements of the ritual to converge. The lighthouse shuddered violently, a groan of tortured stone and metal. Reid felt something tear within him, a ripping sensation, as if an invisible tether had been violently severed. He was left alone, shivering, the echoes of a scream still ringing in the cavern of his mind. Had it worked? The taste in his mouth was not of metal, but something far more bitter and ancient, like pulverized bone mixed with the salt spray that perpetually coated the interior of the abandoned lighthouse. Reid's eyelids felt like lead weights, each blink a monumental effort. He lay sprawled on the cold, gritty stone floor of the lighthouse's base, the iron-bound journal clutched against his chest like a shield. His fingers were stiff, cramped around the leather, the metallic tang of dried blood faint on his knuckles. A low thrum vibrated through the very air, a residual tremor that resonated in his teeth. The ritual. He remembered the blinding flash, the guttural shriek that had torn through the night, a sound that wasn't of any creature he knew, but of something far older, far more violated. He remembered the surge of power, raw and untamed, rushing through him, threatening to unravel his very being. Then, nothing but the echo of that scream and a sudden, profound silence. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting with a dull ache. His head swam, the world tilting precariously. The narrow windows of the lighthouse offered only a murky gray light, the sky outside a bruised canvas. A storm must have passed, or was still brewing. He tasted ash on his tongue, a ghost of the burned herbs and dust he'd offered. The air still hung heavy, not with the typical damp ocean scent, but with something acrid, a metallic tang beneath the brine, like ozone after a lightning strike. He looked down at himself. His clothes were torn, singed in places. It pulsed with a dull, insistent rhythm. He staggered to the spiral staircase, his boots scraping on the stone. Each step was a battle against vertigo, against the lingering sense that the floor might drop out from beneath him. He made it to the top, to the lantern room, the glass panes streaked with salt and rain. And there, nestled within its depths, was the cabin. It looked different. The raw, malevolent aura that had always seemed to cling to it, a visible ripple in the air, was gone. It stood, a silent, gray structure, seemingly innocuous. It was too profound, too absolute. It was the quiet of a wound that had closed, but left a vast, echoing cavity behind. Reid's gaze lingered, searching for any sign, any flicker of the horror that had tormented him. Nothing. Only the cabin, still and unmoving, like a tombstone in the vast, green sea of the forest. Had he truly banished it? Or had he merely driven it deeper, allowing it to burrow into the very fabric of the earth, or worse, into himself? He brought a trembling hand to his forehead, touching the gash. He'd won, hadn't he? He'd followed his great-grandmother's frantic instructions, performed the counter-ritual. He'd survived. The cost. He remembered the final instruction in the journal, the one he'd dismissed as symbolic. A piece of yourself, given willingly, to bind the pact. He'd offered the lock of his hair. The profound emptiness wasn't just exhaustion. It was a blank space where certain memories should have been, specific details about the entity, about why it had chosen his family, about the generations-old pact. It was as if a part of his mind, the part that truly understood the depth of the horror, had been excised, a sacrifice demanded not just of his physical self, but of his very comprehension. The details were hazy, like trying to grasp smoke. The cabin was silent, but Reid was not. A low, persistent hum had taken root behind his eyes, a phantom echo of the ritual. The horror hadn't been banished, it had been absorbed, transformed. It had left its mark, not just on the forest, but on him. He was alive, yes. But the world had irrevocably shifted. The veil between the mundane and the monstrous had thinned, perhaps for good. He was a survivor, but also a sentinel, forever marked by what he had faced. He was free of the cabin's grasp, but bound, in a far more insidious way, to the very horror he had sought to defeat. He lay sprawled on the cold, gritty floor, the chill seeping into his very bones, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. He tried to remember. A blinding flash, a shriek that tore through the very fabric of the air, the shattering of something impossibly old and fragile. Then silence, save for the ceaseless groan of the wind outside the lighthouse's thick walls, and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against unseen rocks. He pushed himself up, every muscle protesting, a symphony of creaks and groans echoing his own. The air, though no longer thick with the suffocating presence of the entity, still carried a faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying orchids. His vision swam, the spiraling stairs of the lighthouse tower blurring into an indistinct tunnel. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble, the grime caked into his pores. He was alive. He had survived. But at what cost? He understood it all now. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the cabin, a living, hungry manifestation of generations of fear and appeasement, anchored by the ancient burial ground. His relative, the previous owner, hadn't just died, he had been consumed, a final, desperate meal to prolong the horror. Reid had faced it, not with courage, but with a desperate, primal will to simply not be next star. The wind tore at him the moment he pushed it open, a furious, cleansing blast that stung his eyes and roared in his ears. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun a sliver on the horizon, painting the churning sea in shades of blood and ash. The lighthouse stood on a desolate promontory, a stark, solitary sentinel. He looked back towards the direction of the forest, towards where the cabin had stood. A faint, acrid smell drifted on the wind, something akin to burnt wood and damp earth. He didn't need to see it to know. The cabin was gone. Whether it had crumbled into dust, devoured itself, or simply ceased to exist, he couldn't say. But its presence, its malevolent gravity, was gone. The journey away from the lighthouse was a blur of aching limbs and a mind that refused to settle. He walked for what felt like days, though he knew it could only have been hours, fueled by a frantic need to put distance between himself and that place. He eventually stumbled onto a forgotten logging road, then a paved one, and finally, a small, nameless town. He caught his reflection in the dusty window of a closed general store. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken, hair matted. He looked like a ghost, haunted by things no living person should ever witness. But there was something else there, too. A hardened edge, a strange, unsettling clarity. He was no longer just Reid, he was a survivor, a witness, a vessel for a terrible truth. He found an abandoned truck stop, its doors hanging ajar, and collapsed onto a grimy bench. He knew it would never leave him. The victory was bittersweet. He had broken the pact, saved himself, perhaps even saved others from the fate of his lineage. But the world he now inhabited felt thinner, more fragile, its comforting illusions shattered. He saw the cracks, the places where the mundane reality frayed, revealing the older, hungrier truths beneath. A few days later, after finding a bus ticket to a city far from the forgotten forest, he sat by a window, watching the landscape blur. He felt the rumble of the engine, the subtle sway of the vehicle. He was free. Yet, as the bus passed a patch of particularly dense woods, a shiver traced its way up his spine. He blinked, and it was gone, replaced by the mundane greens and browns of the roadside. He had merely bought time, for himself and perhaps for others. The horror had not been destroyed, it had merely been reminded of its place, forced back into the periphery. He had survived, yes, but he would never truly be free.